So why don't we get started? Well, Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fall 2019 International Affairs Speaker Series here at College of the Mainland. My name is John Presnall, and I'm a professor of government. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to give thanks for assistance in putting this event together. First, I want to thank the Student Activities Board for their continued support. Also, I want to thank the members of the Speakers Committee for all their hard work. Professors Robert Castro, Ching Lee, Rafael Naranjo, and Shinya Wakao, as well as Stacy Henderson, the chair of the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and Dr. Stephen Sewell, Dean of Academic Programs. Our speaker today is Dr. Neil Rogachevsky. He teaches Israel Studies and Political Thought at the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University in New York City. He will be speaking today about current issues surrounding populism and politics in France. The title of his talk is The Gilets Jaunes as Case Study in the Failure of Representative Government. Dr. Rogachevsky received his PhD in French history from the University of Cambridge in 2014, and he did graduate work at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, Georgetown University, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the University of Toronto. His academic work has appeared in French history. A native of Toronto, Dr. Rogachevsky received his BA from McGill University. He is also a journalist and essayist whose writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Mosaic, The American Interest, The Atlantic, Commentary, the Claremont Review of Books, Haaretz, and other publications. Today's talk will be 45 minutes or so, followed by a Q&A period. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rogachevsky.
All right. Can you hear me in the back? I did this before. I'd like to check again. My resonant. Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Professor Presnall. I'm delighted to be here at this wonderful college and in this wonderful state. As Professor Presnall mentioned, I'm a native of Canada, and as a relative newcomer to the United States, I've always wanted to visit Texas, this being my first visit, and I could think no better way, no better situation to do so than coming here to talk about politics and ideas with all of you. It is perhaps in bad taste, but I can't resist beginning this lecture by quoting myself. And in an even greater instance of bad taste, referring to myself approvingly. It was 2012. I was living in Paris doing research for my doctoral dissertation on the history of democracy in France, while also, as I said, wearing my other hat as a journalist. I was filing regular reports on the French presidential election that year for American newspapers and magazines. That election had pitted the incumbent conservative Nicolas Sarkozy against a socialist candidate and eventual winner, François Hollande. In my report of that presidential election of May 2012, which happened, by the way, before the contest between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney here, I summed up the election accordingly. Quote, "The French campaign was, at its core, about globalization, namely the remorseless progress of global competition and accompanying homogenization, which can kill everything from manufacturing to local customs, from the Peugeot car company to the neighborhood brasserie, if you're not careful. If the French election is any indication, the Western democracies are very far from ready to meet the challenge of globalization with the necessary confidence." Now, I remember showing this article at a time to a very well-placed American politician, and it elicited a kind of patronizing chuckle. France and Europe on the whole, I was told, might very well be undergoing an existential crisis about its place in the world, but America was different. American politics simply consisted of the usual disagreements about the size and scope of government at home and the kind of foreign interventions America might engage in abroad. There was little or no appetite here, I was told, for a fundamental rethinking of the kind of globalization that America had done so much to midwife. Subsequent events, the 2015 Brexit vote and the 2016 election of President Trump, along with continued strengthening of populist parties and movements in France and Europe as a whole, have shown that America and indeed the Western world as a whole has not been immune from this kind of existential politics, which I first started to see in France in 2012. And it indeed is the case that that election of 2012, which produced a victory of a socialist president in France, was indeed a harbinger for things to come. As we stand here in 2019, I think it's very hard to deny that the questions of, say, the decline of a local manufacturing base, questions of labor competition, whether foreign or domestic, the extent to which supranational institutions are serving the interests of specific countries, of our countries or at the world at large, have become the central political questions. Now, it would be possible to discuss this subject in the context of the United States. What I propose to do is mostly to keep the discussion on France. I'm sure as part of this distinguished speaker series or in your various American or Texas politics class, you've talked about some of these themes: populism, globalization, Trump presidency, obviously, and so on. And perhaps you've talked about them ad infinitum. So I think a look across the ocean at the situation in France would be helpful, not only to help us learn something about France, very interesting, important country, but also give us some necessary comparative perspective on the situation in the United States as well. Okay, so I mentioned in the title of my talk this the Gilets Jaunes protest movement, the yellow vest. Have you guys heard of this? Have you seen this on the news? What have you seen? Mostly people smashing up Chanel's and McDonald's? Yeah, permanent. I mean, that's a great image, right? I mean, you can't. No one will get tired of that. So I want to discuss this Gilets Jaunes movement. You could say this protest movement, which has been going on for a year, as an example of the kind of revolt against globalization, an example of a kind of populist politics which is rising in Europe. And I want to do some comparisons at the end to populism in the United States and highlight some similarities, but also some crucial differences that exist. So one might say, at least provisionally, that the Gilets Jaunes movement represents a critical new example of a populist revolt against the establishment, precisely on this question of globalization and the effects of globalization on the French hinterland, right? However, what I'll argue as well is that this movement, which is very, in a way, confused when you try to ask it, okay, you're protesting, you don't like the direction of politics, you don't like declining wages, you don't like jobs being shipped overseas, such and such, what do you want as an alternative? The answers are very rarely coherent and clear, right? So it's seen as a protest, but what the alternative is to the current order, that is much less clear. So that hopefully should come out over the course of this talk. Okay, so first some introductory remarks in terms of who exactly are these Gilets Jaunes? What is this Gilets Jaunes protest movement? So the Gilets Jaunes is French. Is literally what it means is it's a safety vest, right? It's a yellow vest, right? And every French car, there must be one of these Gilets Jaunes in every French car on the road in France in case of a roadside emergency in conditions of low visibility. I'm sure you'll all be very shocked that the French state likes to regulate details down to that level of political life. But so it's the case. So it's by law you must have a Gilets Jaunes in your car. So last summer and last fall, summer of 2018 and 2019, suddenly, almost out of nowhere, as we've been accustomed to seeing in protest movements now around the world, right? The way chat rooms and Facebook messages and WhatsApp groups, these kinds of things, it suddenly became a meme, right? We are the Gilets Jaunes, and it was adopted by protesters who were in the first instance drivers. There were people who relied on their car and who were angry about rising fuel prices in France, right? Now, this had less to do with fluctuations in the oil price. Actually, global oil prices were declining during that time. It had to do with the extremely high levels of taxation on gas in in France, right? So, you guys you're in Texas, you're drivers, you're very sensitive to these sorts of things. Imagine whatever you pay to fill up your tank, times, almost times 2, and that's what it costs to fill up your tank in France, right? The taxes on gas or fuel are immense, right? So the government of French President Emmanuel Macron had permitted a tax on gas to increase dramatically, and he faced this spiraling revolt of drivers who are upset about this, and in general with the declining purchasing power of what one might call the upper lower class or the lower middle class, right? This spike in fuel prices was seen by some as a slap in the face to French who don't live in fashionable urban cities, right? Or where they make so much. I don't know if you guys have visited Paris or whatever. Hopefully you all will one day. It's worth visiting. They make such a strenuous effort to keep cars out of the center of the city, right? To make this comfortable for urban pedestrians, and as a result, these places, some of them look marvelous. It's not only Paris, Bordeaux, Marseille, other cities. Bike lanes are promoted. Again, this is as a New Yorker, the bike is seen to be a holy instrument of transportation. Maybe it's less so here, but in France, that's another thing. It's elevated. Oh, you should all bike. You should never drive. So there was dissatisfaction with that by people who don't live in these fashionable urban centers, who live places where there isn't good public transportation, and they're forced to get around by car, right? For getting to work, for going to the grocery store, for the basic necessities of daily life. So in the first instance, it was kind of an interesting protest movement in that it wasn't a protest of the very poor, right, of the kind we've seen in recent years, also and some actually in France, right. You could say this was it started at least as a you could say a lower middle class protest movement, and the word often heard was pouvoir d'achat, purchasing power, right? People could decline that, okay, they're earning the same salary, wages have been stagnant, but gasoline prices, other prices have been perpetually rising, and the haughty politicians in Paris, they're paying no attention for us whatsoever, right? The complaint was often heard, there was a macro complaint offered against the French government or French politics in general, that it represented an alliance of the rich, who could afford gas prices if they had a car, or they lived in fancy cities where they didn't have to drive very much, and the poor, who got the French welfare state is exceedingly generous, so they received subventions, etc. So it was an alliance of the rich and the poor against the middle, right? People who do work for a living and thus don't benefit from the same generous welfare state that truly poor people have, but who have been seen their ability just to live, to put food on the table, to conduct their lives, to raise their families. They've seen themselves squeezed, right? So the critique was, okay, French government, this is rich and poor. What about the middle, right? Well, there's a tyranny on the middle, right? So that was in the first instance. That was the first critique, and it led to this truly shocking protest movement on the streets of Paris, which erupted on the streets in November 2018, happening like clockwork every Saturday in Paris, other major cities, and also in these roundabouts on the highway. Again, the theme of driving was very important in that, which symbolized the act of driving in France, and which have continued until today. Right? They're happening every Saturday. That in recent weeks and in recent months, one has to say, the strength of this movement has gone downhill. That first protest was attracted over 200,000 people in Paris alone. It was astonishing protest, not quite Hong Kong levels, but close. And it maintained that energy throughout its first several months, but has been declining since, right? And so in the first instance, one has to say, it's hard not to sympathize with that initial critique, right? You look at France, and again, you guys could think of other governments about, the amount of political attention and energy devoted to improving life in, the urban core, right? The vast amount of resources spent on, bike lanes, public transportation, cultural projects, and on the other hand, vast regions, the hinterland of France, benefiting from none of this spending, none of the lavish cultural budget also, which a French state spends on Paris and Bordeaux and other such cities, and feeling like, okay, why is this really the best use of the resources of their state, right? Shouldn't there be, shouldn't things be working differently? And there was a sense also that if you pick up the French press on an average weekend, there's some long reportage about the state of very poor people living in the place called the banlieue. These urban centers that are around Paris, which are sort of like concrete jungles, et cetera, which are very poor places, which have their own set of major issues. It's a major issue, but the French press would be totally focused on that, right? The issues surrounding Islamism, just poverty in general, the lack of good employment opportunities for there, to like people who are areas where there's tremendous unemployment, and very little on the issues of people who do work, but just are every year they're struggling more and more to feed themselves, right? So this was the core of the critique that was in the initial Gilets Jaunes movement, and it caught the French state almost totally off guard, right? Emmanuel Macron responding to this level of violence and protest on the streets. He was seen as very distant at first. He's the example of an out of touch Paris politician, not paying attention to the countryside, and every gesture he made was sort of ham-fisted. He went on this sort of listening tour, like, oh, the king descends from his carriage to go listen to the poor provincials speak for 15 minutes and then makes it all okay, right? So there was that sort of element, and it did nothing at first to quash the energy of this protest movement, right? But eventually, over time, it seems like the energy, partially as a result, we were talking about this a bit earlier, the French police engaged in some pretty serious repression, which would raise eyebrows in the United States. Actually, everyone thinks of France as a very liberal place in a certain sense, but the police power, what people, they don't have a Bill of Rights, right? So what police are able to do in terms of protests, they can arrest people in advance sometimes. They can do all kinds of things, right? Like the traditions of civil liberties are less directly pronounced in the civil code of France than they are in America, Britain, et cetera. So strong repression and also some concessions. Macron delayed this new tax. He essentially lowered tax on petrol. And for the time being, this was, the movement has lost some of its energy, right? But for all that, I still think it's, extremely worthy of consideration. Okay, what else to say about this? There are leaders. There have been leaders in this movement, but like other protest movements, it's very noticeable, and I think this explains both some of their strength and their weakness. The leaders are not really formal, right? They're not part of, the protest wasn't organized by a union, which sometimes happens in France, right? It was organized, there's a prominent figure who starts a WhatsApp group, he gets all of his, his mates, let's go, we're gonna go protest, et cetera, right? But he has no formal position, right? So as a result, the leaders all rely in a way on reputation. Oh, I'm seen to be a leader of this new movement, right? And this leads in a way to a kind of weakness, right? I mean, you think back at some of the greatest, clashes between a government, protest movement. If any of you know some British politics, in the 1980s, you had Arthur Scarsgill, right? He was the head of the miners' union in Britain, right? He was facing off against Margaret Thatcher, and that was a real contest. It was a battle to the death between the two of them, because Scarsgill had the whole, the power of the unions behind it. There was an official body who was supporting this, or like, okay, Thatcher is trying to close down the mines, and we're trying to keep them open, and this is a blood sport clash, right? This is less so. These Gilets Jaunes leaders, are they rise and fall. It's amorphous, so they can gain. Some of them have gained tremendous following, but the following that they've attained can quickly dissipate later, right? So we could say there's a fancy word, there's a postmodern element to some of that. What have they advocated for? This is another thing. So some of the grievances, you'd have to say in a certain sense, their main grievance was successful, right? The removal of this added fuel tax, which Macron allowed to pass. This was removed. They had a host of other things that they asked for, including more plebiscites, referendum, and direct democracy. So it sounds like, okay, we're going to, instead of deciding something in Paris by means of the parliament with the support of the president, you need to approach the people directly, right? Consult us over a political question, and we'll vote one way or another, and that's a policy that has to be implemented, right? They wanted more direct democracy in France, and they also wanted, fewer perceived tax breaks for the rich. So you can say it's a grab bag of political opinions which are innovative. Some of them are traditionally associated with the left, some of them traditionally associated with the right, but all of them sort of in this major melange of a movement. One other thing to say about them is has to be mentioned. In addition to some what I would say consider some legitimate political points, there was a healthy dose of conspiracy theories in this movement, right? Blaming the Rothschild banking family, right? That became a trope of the Gilets Jaunes, right? The fact that the current president of France had been a banker in this, banking house, the Rothschild banking house, which was a very important banking. It helped with, in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was, very big in the rise of capitalism in Western countries. But at this point, it's like an extremely small family bank, right? But the fact that Macron, the president, had been a Rothschild banker, lit people up. Oh, this is part of a international financial conspiracy. That's why our purchasing power is lower in France, because these greedy bankers are crushing us, right? In February 2019, there had been a survey of Yellow Vests, and 44% had said there is a worldwide Zionist conspiracy to take over the world. Again, why is our purchasing power down? It's because of a Zionist conspiracy theory. There's some other stats which, again, we maybe take some of this with a grain of salt. All this stuff is very hard to measure. 59% had said, Princess Diana was probably assassinated, right? So it was an atmosphere in which conspiratorial thinking flourished, right? But I think this is interesting. It's, an example of, how conspiracy theories can flourish. This is, if you guys have studied American politics, you may have come across an author, Alexis de Tocqueville, who writes about these issues, like what kind of ideas do people get in democracies? And he sort of points out that conspiracies can flourish in a situation when people are very removed from participating in political affairs themselves, right? So if you like, some of you guys may go to Austin, you'll do an internship in Texas politics or whatever, you get a sense of like how politics actually happens, right? How the sausage is made, right? Proverbially, right? And when you do that, you have a sense, okay, this isn't the way, the Texas, House, came to this decision, and not that decision is not due to some, crazy external abstract thing, but it's because, this guy cut a deal with that guy, and that's how politics, that's the nuts and bolts of politics, right? But if you're way cut out from politics, if you're cut off from politics, if you're not paying attention to it, you can these fantasies, at these very abstract views about how things actually work, can grow up, right? So the fact that conspiracies flourished in this venue should not surprise us, and unfortunately, I think we should look for, wouldn't be surprised to see more conspiracies flourish in other locations as well. Okay, so this is basically a sense of who they are, what they've been asking for, the situation in France with respect to them. So as I said before, when Professor Presnell asked me to talk about these guys last spring, I said, okay, this is an issue of tremendous moment. It looked as if for a while that it might totally bring down this current president, Emmanuel Macron. Right, it seemed he had the protests seemed to be growing. He had no response. It seemed like it could actually, there's a kind of street movement, which has happened in the past, right? General de Gaulle was in a way almost brought down by street protests in France in the late 1960s. It looked like that could be happening as a result of this movement. But things have changed a little bit. His position seems to be a bit stronger. He's had other successes in Europe. It's too complicated to get into, but his chief rival over the direction of European politics, Salvini in Italy, is out of office. German politics have shifted in a way that could seem to be favorable to France. So Macron seems to be in a stronger position, right? However, I think this is quite illusory, right? I think personally that France is really caught in a trap of which the Gilets Jaunes movement is revealing, of low productivity, low economic growth, high unemployment, political and social stagnation that it's been able to cover over, at various times, briefly, but has not been able to truly transcend. Okay, so what do I think? So what does the Gilets Jaunes say about what we've called our populist moment, and what I've also called, this revolt against globalization? I think it says the following. I think that in many ways this dissatisfaction with this interconnected global order is extremely strong, and the dissatisfaction with our economic order, right? I keep on using this word globalization in a sense because part of the critique of the Gilets Jaunes was, okay, it's not simply, it's not that power is dispersed to Paris, but the lack, the good jobs are being shipped overseas. Our wages have been real wages have been declining. So when I say so this critique of the center, this critique of Paris is in a way aligned with a critique of globalization. So that dissatisfaction I think is real, and its political energy is no way exhausted. However, I think in France, I mean, I hear hopefully turn back to the United States a little bit. I don't believe that the rejection, this sort of much of the populist critique of the current economic and political order is yet very coherent and yet very, or if it ever could be, who knows? But I don't think it's very directed towards a concrete alternative to what we have now, right? So I see this by looking at what the Gilets Jaunes asked for, right? So their one concrete demand, which was lower fuel prices, they received, right? Macron, he held back for a while. He said these taxes were, important for the French state or whatever, but they successfully ultimately gave in, and they attained that, right? So again, it's a bit cheaper to drive, right? And that's recognizable class politics, right? That's saying, okay, we rely, this class of people, we rely on driving, make our lives a bit better, right? But otherwise, all of these demands have been unfulfilled, and in a way, extremely hard to fulfill. So this demand that they have for, okay, we want government not by a haughty elite in Paris, we want a government by referendum, right? We want direct democracy, right? So so certain states in the United States have referenda. California, Wisconsin, the states which were very influenced by progressivism in Germany in the 19th century. Long story. Anyway, so they have it, but so you can imagine it working on certain issues. But really, in the context of modern society, can you imagine saying, okay, we're no longer, every political decision we want to make, all right, what are we going to do versus, in Saudi Arabia, we're going to subject that to immediate public question for the people, not only to vote, but to say, okay, here's the process, here's what our foreign policy is going to be, right? And even France, which has had much more of a history of those kinds of direct interventions in politics, they have a long tradition of referenda, et cetera. I mean, that would seem to be hard to implement. And in this context, one could think, I know some of you are studying American government, the critique of this mode of politics is really the locus classicus of it is really in the American Federalist Papers, right? The work justifying the Constitution written in 1787 would say that frequent referenda, if you simply submit everything to the people all the time, then there's going to be anarchy in the laws, right? Because no one will take the laws seriously because, if they know that, we're just going to turn these over, every few months, right? Can you really imagine a, stable political entity being governed on that basis, right? So, those demands are, so there's a way of saying that many of their demands have been very abstract, right? Very abstract, not very realistic, not thought out as to how they might work, right? So in many respects, it looks like it is a kind of, you could say it's a plea, right? It's a plea, pay attention to us, be more representative, be more attuned to our interests. But it hasn't, which I think was a goal of this movement and other protest movements, you could say, around the world, it hasn't been able to say, okay, we're going to have a new way of doing things, we're going to throw out the old bums, and we're going to govern ourselves in a totally different way, right? I mean, they're very far from offering that kind of critique. So one more point, and here I want to get into the differences. How are we doing with time, by the way? We have a bit of time, huh? About 10 more minutes? Yeah. Oh, great. Okay, I didn't see that. Yeah. All right, so here I'm going to get a little bit into differences between the United States and France in terms of protest movements, populism, and so on. So I'm repulsed by political violence. I never would justify, I'm very, very against it in pretty much all circumstances, except you could say, the right to revolution, 1776, okay, maybe I could get behind that, although as a Canadian, I think, I got to be worried there'll be some Mounties outside who'll get mad at me for that. So, except in the most extreme circumstances, I'm against it. I'm against it. But what I have to say is I'm not surprised by this, and that in a way, this kind of critique which is existing in France, it had to exert itself in the street, in political violence. Why? It has to do with the character of French political institutions, right? This is why, right? So France, unlike the United States, doesn't have an electoral college. It doesn't have a federal system of government. It has direct election of the president, right? Just everyone in the country decided, like on the day of the election, they said, okay, who are we going to vote for president, right? And they have deputies, they have a parliament, but in practice, the parliament is so, their power is so minimal. They have delegated authorities. They're not like, the power of an average member of the deputy in the French House of Representatives is, you could say, 100th the power of a congressman here. And the Senate in France is ceremonial, right? So there aren't like local bodies of powers. You have, senators from Texas are household names throughout the United States, right? There's literally no local representative, maybe one or two who've had national political careers, but otherwise there are no household names or simply regional politicians in France, right? Because they simply don't have the same power, right? So as a result of this, the people who live in these sort of, the core of the Gilets Jaunes, not people who lived in Paris or Bordeaux or any of these famous cities you've heard of, are people who live in the hinterlands, right? The hinterlands, the middle of the country, sort of exurbs, small village, maybe not the smallest villages, but medium-sized villages, and so on, right? And these people really have very few means of expressing their political will, right? When they can vote, but on a French presidential campaign, it's not as if every French candidate is going to visit these people, right? Because their votes would ultimately be swallowed. Their votes would be swallowed up, right? They need to focus on the big cities. That's where they need to run up numbers, right? When you have direct election for the president, you just need to get as many votes as you can. It doesn't matter where you get them from, right? So you spend time in Paris, you spend time in Lyon, you spend time in Marseille, you go to a few ceremonial things around the country, but you're not doing what American politicians do, right? Which is to go to New Hampshire. It's hilarious, right? They have that joke that every New Hampshire resident has met 15 presidential candidates, right? We have regionalism, right? You go, there's every state and has its own say. In the election of not only the Senate, but the highest office in the land. So it can't be totally ignored, right? Whereas in France, these people who live in the peripheral France, right, la France périphérique, as it's been called, they have no, there's no one they can call. There's no one really they can call if they have any complaint. They have their votes really don't count that much. So it's really it's a kind of political dispossession, which is really a democratic deficit, one could say, which is really quite strong, right? So again, I've already been doing this. So my intent was to contrast that to the structures in the United States, right, which I think federalism and the electoral college, right, I think are very important to think about in this regard, right? I'm very glad in a way we're having this debate in America now, electoral college, good, bad, et cetera. So it's very interesting. And whatever you think about this, this question of the Gilets Jaunes representation is very important for how we think about these sorts of things, right? Because what does the Electoral College do? The Electoral College says, no, it's not simply a case of running up numbers, right? It's not simply, if you get the most votes, you don't necessarily win, right? We saw this in 2016. No, you need, in addition to having numbers, you need to have regional diversity, right? You need to build up a coalition of states, right? The American political system is not sheer majoritarianism as the French system more or less is because of the power of the French presidency. And what that means is, one, I think that politicians have to be kept slightly more honest. They have to go around the 50 United States. People all states have more, you could say, more political power and purchase. so it does that, and I think personally, I think that's quite helpful. But two, it means that protest movements, sort of populist movements, right? Populist, rejection of the system, those are more easily integrated within the structures of American politics, right? And in a way, they're also made more moderate about that, right? Oh, I don't have to, if I'm disgusted with, take an older example, 2010, right? If I'm a Tea Partier and I'm disgusted by Obama's bank bailouts, I don't have to go in the streets. I can mobilize and I can field these candidates, and we can hopefully get a new kind of lobby within Congress itself, right? We have that's more available to us, right? And so I think that's helpful. Now, unfortunately, I'm not saying this institutional thing is a panacea, right? Unfortunately, we do have a specter of political riots and violence in the United States now. But I happen to think that without the Electoral College and federalism, these things could be indescribably worse, right? So in my view, again, I would be interested in your views on this. I think the example of France and the Gilets Jaunes should make us, somewhat appreciative, or at least willing to give the American system a, second look on this matter, right? The American system allows us, because of the Electoral College, because of the states, because of regionalism, it allows people to channel, grievances in the system, right? If you want to drain the swamp, okay, I've got to elect, I'm not going to go to Washington and try to smash it up, or I hope not. I'm going to elect candidates to go there and win and work with or against colleagues in Washington. If I want a socialist revolution, quote unquote, got to do likewise, right? I'm not going to go around the existing structures. I'm going to go to Congress, and I'll have to face off against my rivals and so on. And in the process of that, maybe there's more. You could say there's more moderation, a more moderate result comes out than in other countries. Now, this is not to say that the ideas channeled through the system will always be wise, right? Or that a functioning electoral process, and for all its flaws, I still think the American system is functioning in this sense. It's not to say, so even if this is working well, it's not to say that we'll have necessarily better politics, right? That's an important thing to say, right? So when addressing the concerns of populist movements like the Gilets Jaunes about the lack of good jobs, the demechanization, the declining manufacturing base, and all the things that went with that, lowering purchasing power, all these sorts of things. It's not simply enough to say like, oh, we have a political system for that; it will all work itself out, right? You still need good decisions, right? You still need strong political decisions, which will say like, okay, we're faced with this real, unless you decide that these grievances are simply imaginary, right? Which I think it'd be hard to maintain. But if you say like, oh, there's something true in the Gilets Jaunes critique of the contemporary establishment that manufacturing jobs used to pay well, now they don't. What happened? If you think there's something true in that, you can't just say, oh, our system will diffuse why people are angry about that. You still need good policies, right? You need a good politics which will actually institute a program to address that, right? So whether you have a presidential system like France, where the president has a lot of power, or you have a federal system like the United States, unless you have a good politics to deal with the kind of anger that many people are feeling, then the fact of having a good constitution or an electoral college is not going to save us. So. I think I'll stop there. If you're happy to discuss any of the issues I brought up, could talk more directly about populism in the United States, to answer questions about Paris, whatever you guys like. So thank you for your attention.
If you have a question, raise your hand and we can throw the microphone, hopefully not at you.
Does there seem to be general content with the EU?
That's a very interesting question. I had that in my notes. I didn't bring it up. There is no. It's another example, I think, of why this is a critique rather than a program. Right? There are some elements in French politics which would say, oh, the way out of our solution is leaving the EU. Right? There are some elements. The Marine Le Pen party, which is came in second in the last presidential election, flirted with that kind of Euroscepticism without going there, right? But on the whole, there have been very few people that are very fearful of taking that step, right? It's a very interesting thing, right? So the dissatisfaction with the current order hasn't really extended to a sense of, oh, we're going to leave the European Union, right? They feel that all French parties, you could say, feel that their relative economic weakness, in contrast to Germany, compels them to be in the European Union for now, right? So, but the European Union might hurt them in other ways also. So it's a very complicated situation in that respect. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm wondering about what the situation of the parties would be then, and is there an issue with the elites, that somehow the elites would go either the Le Pen party to go towards the Gilets Jaunes, or at least the hinterland people, maybe not Gilets Jaunes, but hinterland people, and then you have the other parties, which would be the more urban or sophisticated side. Is there no elite attempt to try to figure out a way to make a partisan grab for the most votes that would somehow try to avoid either of those?
Avoid. Well, that's what the Macron. I mean, that's so two things, right? So they're this is something I also didn't mention. So the political parties, obviously, whenever you see like a big movement, they're interested in that. Political candidates, political entrepreneurs, right? And so there have been attempts, both by, you could say, the extent to which these labels are accurate or whatever, we'd have to go into. So no judgment. I'll just use your shorthand. The attempts to capture the Gilets Jaunes have been offered by the far left, a party led by a man called Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and the far right, led by Marine Le Pen. These two figures, both of them have said, "Oh, these are naturally our voters, right? These are voters who are of the middle class or the lower middle class, and they're neglected by the establishment, and we have a way of appealing to them, right? So both of them, they've sort of been fighting it out over this electorate, and you could say they've been splitting that electorate. So far, there have been various attempts to try to combine these sorts of things, but it's fallen down on all kinds of ways, because the central problem that the far left would have in that respect is they're functionally like an open borders party, right? So that's something that really doesn't appeal to the Gilets Jaunes, right? So so that's been the blocking to having right left alliance on that issue would represent them, right? On the other hand, the mainstream parties have tried all kinds of things, right? And, after all, the Gilets Jaunes are not in power, right? And there is you could call it the current government of France. You'd call it a centrist technocratic government, right? It's not highly ideological. It's had attempts. Okay, we're going to find the best. It has something of a conservative flavor on economic issues. Like, oh, the taxes are too high, labor laws are too rigid. We're being left behind. And it is something, a left flavor on, social issues, et cetera. But in general, you could say it's a, centrist, technocratic movement, right? I said, okay, we're less interested in these, identity issues, and we're going to try to find, solutions, that will, work for all of France, right? The issue is, just the situation hasn't improved, right? So there've been all kinds of, in a way, many, Macron's presidency was all about this, right? I'm going to have a center vision. I'm going to go beyond these divisions. This is an elite party, but we're still going to, we're going to work on behalf of, France as a whole. And, maybe he's had some successes, but you're in a position of very low economic growth year after year, decade after decade in France, right? And no politician has successfully been able to break through that. And as a result, the dissatisfaction has grown and grown, right? So it's really a complicated political situation, I'd say, right? And yet these issues that sense of like, okay, maybe there are people who look at this and say like, oh, the only way to do this is actually blow up the European Union, release the animal spirits of each of the national countries, but that would have its own set of very grave problems as well, right? So you understand, I talk to my French friends, are very depressed, right? They have a sense like, okay, things aren't good. They don't, but like, which, okay, how do they get better, right? I mean, there's this mood of, you could say national decline, national depression, something like that is very strong. Yeah.
As you know, immigration is a very important topic in the United States, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that issue in French politics.
Yeah, so it's less. So it's more the issue. The issue these days is more the number of immigrants who've come through immigrant channels in recent years has gone down quite a bit over recent decades. The issue is more about migrants, right? Migration. Yeah, exactly. Migration into Europe has been, obviously a fundamental issue. It's much bigger in Germany, you could say, which had a much larger share of the migrants who are coming from Syria and elsewhere in the Arab world in the wake of the Syria disaster. But that's an electric issue. There's been tremendous popular opposition to that, you could say. And Macron, actually interestingly, Macron is presented as a great liberal figure, but he's been pretty hard-edged himself on this. He's turned away certain migrant ships, these sorts of things, right? It's a popular position, you could say, other than the far left in France, not to say like, oh, we're going to welcome everyone, right? Of course, there's a certain generosity. You're like, yes, we need to integrate. People are here. That's been important. And then there's a far left. There's a far left chunk, which is far left chunk, 25% of the electorate, which says, oh, we want more migrants. This will be good for us, et cetera. So it's a live issue. But I'd say the majority position is pretty anti-migrant, but worried like, oh, what will the consequences of this be?
Maybe mainly impacting jobs, I was.
Yeah, it's in terms of labor. Well, it's not actually because it's very hard. It's a different situation than in the U.S. Right? It's very hard to get in. Again, the issue is more like, oh, it's a question of the welfare state. How do we pay for this, right? So, and the youth unemployment is tremendous, right? Like 18%, 20%. Something like that, right? So it's not easy for migrants to get a job, right? You can come in, they get public assistance, right? So some do ultimately get citizenship and could work, et cetera. It's just a longer, drawn out process than it is in the United States, legal or illegal employment. Other questions?
Is this the thing? Oh, hi.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that France doesn't have an electoral college.
Right.
And it's kind of insinuated that as a result, the lack of representation of people in more rural areas of the country aren't represented. So is there an alternative to the electoral college? Because as a country with an electoral college, one of the arguments is that there's disproportionate representation. And you can see it in the last election too, because the popular vote wasn't actually what.
Right, exactly. So you're making the contrary case, right? Which is a case that most French people would say, like, oh, this is, you're making them more. It would seem to be more democratic with a small d, right? In the sense, oh, why is it the case that a certain candidate wins by a few million votes and they're not president, right? That would seem to be the case, right? But the theory of representation here was not that representation isn't simply a numerical thing, right? That it's an issue of, what is, the whole interest of a polity, right? The Electoral College was put in so that you couldn't have a situation where the wealthiest, like California and New York, could simply dictate their will on every issue to the whole country, right? And obviously the case that the founders said like, oh, it will be important and good in a way that the very rich, the very populous places will have a big influence, and they obviously do, right? California, Texas, New York have a big influence in the United States, right? I think that is par for the course and admirable, right? The issue that they were hoping to avoid was that there'd be this situation, which I think they looked at the French case, where just like Paris does everything, right? Everything matters. What happens in the streets of Paris is really decisive for the political destiny of the country at large, right? So that's what they were trying to avoid. Of course, it's not. You could look at this and you could say, like, I understand that point of view, right? You just say like, it does sound strange that someone can win by a couple extra, will seemingly win by a couple extra million votes and lose, right? So one could say, oh, those extra votes. From that perspective, you could say, oh, those votes didn't count, right? But the counter would be precisely this, right? That it's not representation is bigger than simply about numbers.
I guess what I was trying to ask are there any popular French ideas? Do they align with the American idea of representation, or do they kind of compromise?
So they have some. They're quite different, as I said, right? Because they have a preference often for for a direct, for again, direct election of the presidency. That's a major difference, right? And it produces these kinds of, it's conducive to the, I don't know if it produces, it's conducive to these kinds of differences. On the other hand, there are some similarities, right? France does have a strong executive, right? So the French president, just like in the United States, like totally controls foreign policy, basically, right? Which was something that de Gaulle, the founder of this French system, he wanted very much, right? He looked in a way to the American, recent American interpretation of the Constitution for that policy, right? And that puts America and France together against, say, a country like Britain, right? Where prime minister is important, but Parliament is has a big role in that also. So there are some similarities, some differences. I think there are big differences. A lack of federalism is a very big difference, I think, and has all kinds of political consequences.
We have time for one more question if anybody has one. He's got one.
Okay, the question that I have, you've described.
Okay, there you go.
You've described the ideals very, very succinctly about what you think, what you believe is happening there politically and emotionally. But what is, I guess, physically happening? The thing I don't understand is what's physically happening in these protests with the Gilets. Is there violence?
So there's been especially at its peak, it's calmed down recently. There had been tremendous violence, clashing with police officers, destroying, using an axe, blowing, setting out fires to cars, smashing up Chanel shops, smashing up a McDonald's, that kind of stuff, right? And you could say the original Gilets Jaunes said, oh, those are just anarchists, those are not part of our movement, right? But it was gradually when people who like to protest will never let a protest go to waste, right? That's one reason why street protests are hard to control, right? It's a lesson if you study the French Revolution. That's another thing. Once you're in the street, it's very hard to control what goes on in the street, right? But so that's what was happening, and the French police was a pretty, couple protesters lost their eyes, a couple people were killed. I mean, there's some real violence there. It hasn't approached Hong Kong levels, but if you're following protests there, but some pretty heavy stuff, right? In recent, happens every Saturday. Read, if you want to read, you guys should read the French press this Saturday and see what the Gilets Jaunes are up to this week. It's been calmer in recent weeks, which maybe the movement will taper out, maybe we'll gain in strength again. We'll see.
Thank you all for attending, and let's give Dr.
Thank you so much.